As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
Imagine North America, where the energy future and technological race depend not on Washington or Beijing, but on a quiet town in northern Ontario. At first glance, it seems like just a regional project, an investment of a few tens of millions. But in reality, it is a step that could tip the balance of power in the global economy. We are talking about cobalt, a metal that is invisible in everyday life, but without which electric cars, energy storage batteries, modern defense systems, and artificial intelligence requiring enormous computing power would be impossible.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
Today, almost all of the world's cobalt passes through China. That is where the processing facilities are concentrated, dictating prices and rules of the game. But an alternative is emerging on the horizon. Canada is launching North America's first large-scale processing plant for the production of cobalt sulfate, the very raw material that auto giants and electronics manufacturers need on an industrial scale. Why is this important? Because the US, accustomed to its role as an industrial leader, finds itself in a position of dependence for the first time. For its green transition, for battery plants and new chip factories, America will be forced to look north. And this changes the very basis of the economic dialogue between Ottawa and Washington.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
The sums involved may seem small tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, but strategic value is not measured solely in monetary terms. Imagine a single factory can provide materials for 1 million electric vehicles a year. A single investment transforms Canada from a supplier of raw materials into a true guardian of critical technologies. And this is happening against a backdrop of unprecedented pressure in the global energy sector. Electricity and gas prices are rising in the United States. Donald Trump's tariff policy is pushing companies to bring production back home. But infrastructure and energy costs are getting higher and higher. While Washington is struggling with internal contradictions, Canada is gradually strengthening its position as an energy superpower, expanding oil and gas exports, building new routes to Europe and Asia, and increasing the production and processing of critical minerals. For the first time in decades, Canada has gained not only economic but also political leverage that cannot be ignored. It used to give in to pressure, whether over timber, milk quotas, or aluminum. Today, things are different. Ottawa now holds the key to the most important technologies of the 21st century.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
What does this mean for the U.S.? New negotiations, new tariff disputes, and new attempts at pressure are coming. But this time, the balance of power has shifted. The question is, will Washington be able to dictate terms if its own energy and technology strategy depends on cobalt processed in northern Ontario? We will talk about this in today's video. This is not just a story about metal. It is a story about how quiet investments can change the geopolitics of an entire continent. Cobalt, a word that hardly appeared in news headlines a few years ago, has now become a symbol of a new energy era. This metal plays a key role in the production of batteries for electric vehicles, energy storage devices, and a whole range of modern technologies. Almost all of the world's cobalt processing has been controlled by China, which has spent decades building supply chains, buying up deposits in Africa, and monopolizing refining. The US, which has declared a course toward technological leadership and a green transition, has in fact been dependent on Beijing's decisions, and this dependence has become increasingly alarming. With Washington declaring a return of industry to the homeland and simultaneously engaging in strategic confrontation with China, the issue of cobalt sources has become a matter of national security. That is why the news of the construction of North America's first large cobalt processing plant in Canada has become a real turning point.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16% 8 times higher, 16% currently.
The project in Ontario, initiated by Electra Battery Materials, is supported by the provincial government with 17.5 million Canadian dollars. At first glance, the amount seems modest, but the symbolism and consequences are incomparably greater. We are not only talking about the launch of production of 6,500 tons of cobalt sulfate per year, which is enough to produce batteries for about 1 million electric vehicles. It is about North America actually starting to process a critical mineral without which the plans of auto giants, energy corporations and arms manufacturers would be impossible. And while in terms of numbers the project looks like one of dozens of regional industrial startups, from a strategic perspective it could change the entire balance of power on the continent. Today, almost 90% of the world's refined cobalt is produced in China. Other countries are content with either ore mining or limited processing volumes. Canada has so far played the role of a raw material supplier without receiving the main profit from added value. Now, everything is changing. The new plant in Ontario is transforming the country from a donor of ore to a player controlling a high-margin link in the chain. For the US, this means not just new trade relations, but dependence on a neighbor that it will have to trust for strategic supplies. The project is being financed from several sources. In addition to Ontario's support, the US Department of Defense has already allocated $20 million, clearly signaling that this is not just an economic issue, but also a matter of national security. Electra is undergoing a major debt restructuring, reducing its debt by approximately 60%, and plans to raise another $30 million through a share issue. At the same time, negotiations are underway with the Canadian federal government for an additional $20 million. The total cost of construction is estimated at approximately 100 million Canadian dollars.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
The importance of this project is further illustrated by the fact that it is being called the first critical mineral enterprise in decades to actually enter industrial production in Canada. Investment analysts have estimated that at current prices, annual revenue from processing could range from $160 million to $230 million, with operating income before taxes and depreciation of approximately $30 million. For the Temiskaming Shores region, where the future plant is located, this also means dozens of new jobs and a whole chain of indirect contracts in construction, logistics, and energy. But in broader terms, the numbers are only part of the picture. The real significance of this plant is that it gives Canada the opportunity to become a kind of guardian of critical technologies for the first time. For Ottawa, this is a chance to strengthen its position in negotiations with Washington, where Canada has usually been forced to make concessions, whether on forest quotas or aluminum tariffs. Now it has leverage that cannot be ignored. In the future, the issue of cobalt will affect not only the automotive industry, but also defense contracts and even areas such as the production of microelectronics and batteries for energy storage systems that power artificial intelligence data centers. The intrigue lies in the fact that there are less obvious motives beyond the official figures. According to several industry research centers, as early as 2023, closed-door negotiations at the G7 summit discussed a scenario in which Canada would take on the role of the main supplier of cobalt in North America in order to minimize dependence on Chinese supplies. The topic was overshadowed at the time by high-profile statements on climate and sanctions, but it was this that paved the way for the current decision. In addition, internal provincial government documents leaked to the press in early 2024 show that the initial plan for the plant was for only 3,000 tons per year, but then the volume was doubled when it became clear that demand from American automakers would exceed expectations.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
There are even more alarming details. Several independent experts point out that without the accelerated commissioning of this facility, the US risks finding itself in a situation where its defense projects will be threatened by a battery shortage by the middle of the decade. Secret Pentagon reports, partially published in the American press, directly warn that critical communication systems and mobile military complexes use batteries with a high cobalt content, and that in the event of a deterioration in relations with China, supply chains will be disrupted. Thus, support for the project in Ontario is not a gesture of goodwill, but part of the US defense strategy. Meanwhile, Canada itself emphasizes in public statements that this is a matter of new industrial policy. The country's prime minister has repeatedly spoken of plans to turn Canada into an energy superpower, not only in oil and gas, but also in critical minerals. The new cobalt processing plant is the first practical step that shows that these words are not just slogans. This has sparked a wave of optimism in the domestic market. Shares in companies involved in the extraction and processing of critical metals have risen by up to 30% in recent months. Bank analysts predict that if the launch is successful, Ontario could become the center of an entire industrial chain, including nickel and manganese processing, which would create synergies and reduce North America's dependence on foreign suppliers. Thus, the first point of the plan, the importance of cobalt and Canada's role, cannot be viewed in isolation. This is not just a question of industrial growth or new jobs. This is a story about how a country that has been in the shadow of major players for decades suddenly gains a strategic resource for negotiations. If yesterday all the talk about cobalt revolved around China and Africa, tomorrow the focus will be on northern Ontario. The second point, the financing and scale of the project, reveals that behind the seemingly modest figures lies a large-scale game. Provincial money, federal negotiations, investments by the US Department of Defense, and the efforts of Electra itself show that this is a project of national and international significance. And although the official construction cost is only $100 million, informal estimates suggest that, taking into account hidden tax breaks and additional infrastructure costs, the total amount of support could exceed $200 million. This is twice the official figures and confirms that Canada and the US are willing to pay to secure control over this strategic metal.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
Looking at it from another angle, it seems that the plant in Ontario is just the beginning. Plans are already being discussed to expand capacity to 10,000 tons per year by 2030. And there are rumors of the creation of an entire cluster of enterprises in the northern provinces. Combined with growing global demand for electric vehicles and energy-intensive artificial intelligence computing, this promises Canada a role it has long dreamed of, not as a supplier of raw materials, but as a full-fledged participant in the global technology race. And this is what makes the story not only economic, but also geopolitical. While the world watches tariffs, sanctions, and loud statements by politicians, a quiet town on the lake is turning into an arena for the battle for the future. Cobalt is becoming a symbol of how a small project can change the trajectory of an entire continent. The economic potential of the Ontario project goes far beyond simple numbers. Yes, there has been talk of projected revenues and operating profits, but what is far more important is the strategic advantages that this new cobalt processing creates for Canada and all of North America. Today, with demand for batteries growing exponentially and the global electric vehicle market developing faster than even the most optimistic experts predicted, the ability to control a critical link in the supply chain becomes more than just an economic issue. It is a question of influence, sustainability, and geopolitical position. One of the main economic effects is Canada's transition from a raw material supplier to a country that retains high added value. This changes the entire logic of its relationship with the US. Whereas Canada was previously forced to concede in trade disputes, whether over dairy products, aluminum, or timber, it now has a resource without which American corporations will be unable to realize their plans for transport electrification and green energy development. Analysts note that in the future, cobalt may occupy the same niche in North American negotiations that oil occupies today in the Middle East, not just a commodity, but a strategic instrument of influence.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States. and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures by U.S. trade partners.
Forecasts indicate that by 2030, global demand for cobalt sulfate could nearly double. With China controlling 70 to 80% of processing, North America is in dire need of alternative sources. The new Canadian plant will only be able to fill part of the gap, but that part will be critically important. Automakers in Detroit, Texas, and California are already considering long-term contracts with Electra, even though the plant is not yet operational. Internal documents from several American companies that have been leaked to the media show that they are willing to pay a premium for stable supplies from Canada in order to reduce their dependence on China. This means that the project's profitability may turn out to be even higher than predicted if the element of reliability of supply is added to the contracts. At the same time, we must not forget about the indirect economic effects. The presence of a large processing plant creates incentives for related industries. There are already discussions about building a research center in Ontario to develop new battery technologies with the direct participation of universities and private laboratories. According to unverified reports, secret negotiations have included the idea of creating a North American alliance of battery manufacturers, with Canada taking on the role of processing critical minerals and the US taking on mass production. If this scenario comes to fruition, the combined benefit to both countries could be measured not in billions, but in tens of billions of dollars per year. But perhaps even more significant is the strategic aspect of this story. Canada gains real leverage over American policy. For the first time in many years, Ottawa can act not as a junior partner, but as a gatekeeper in a key technological sector. This changes not only the economic calculations, but also the psychology of the negotiations. When you have a resource that your ally cannot do without, you start to build the dialogue differently. This was the case with gas in Europe and Russia, and it may now be the case with cobalt and Canada. American officials understand this. It is therefore no coincidence that the US Department of Defense invested in the project while it was still in the planning stage. According to leaks from Congress, closed hearings in early 2024 explicitly stated, "We need to ensure that our northern neighbor remains within the orbit of our interests." This indicates that Washington perceives the project not as a local investment, but as an element of national security.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
This brings us to the next layer, the energy crisis and tariff policy in the US. Along with growing dependence on critical minerals, America is facing unprecedented energy price increases. Last year, consumer electricity bills rose twice as fast as inflation, and the forecasts for the coming years are even more alarming. More than 60 energy companies are preparing to raise rates in 2025, adding tens of billions of dollars in costs to households and businesses. The reason is that demand for electricity is growing faster than at any time in the last 40 years. The main culprits behind this surge are data centers for artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, and the widespread digitization of everyday life. Each new data center consumes energy comparable to that of an entire city, and dozens of such centers are being built across the country. The situation is exacerbated by the fact that the Trump administration's tariff policy, aimed at bringing manufacturing back to the US, is inadvertently increasing the cost of equipment and infrastructure for the energy sector. Tariffs on transformers, turbines, and even solar panels make projects more expensive, slow down construction, and increase the burden on consumers. This paradox is already being called a tariff trap. On the one hand, the US is seeking to ensure energy independence and industrial growth. On the other hand, it is raising the cost of necessary resources, including energy. As a result, manufacturers find themselves in a situation where production costs are rising and competitiveness is declining. In this trap, Canada is becoming almost the only way out. It already supplies more than 80% of the electricity imported into the US, millions of barrels of oil, and significant volumes of natural gas. Against this backdrop, the new cobalt processing project only reinforces the interdependence. There are even more acute scenarios. Some analysts warn that if the trade war between Washington and Beijing escalates, the US could face a shortage not only of cobalt but also of nickel, lithium, and manganese. In this case, Canada, which has all these resources, will become an energy shield for America. And although this is not officially discussed, the idea of joint strategic reserves of critical minerals, similar to oil reserves, is already being discussed behind the scenes. According to unconfirmed reports, The first discussions of this idea took place at the end of 2023 at a closed meeting in Ottawa, attended by representatives of American car manufacturers and energy companies.